We are now going to broaden our focus a little and speak of tech not just as a priority for Singapore, but globally too. And this conversation coming up is going to be in the format of a fireside chat. We have three technology experts, digital chiefs from the US and the UK, to discuss a very specific issue, and that is tech for public good. How can we use technology to improve citizen experience across Singapore, the UK, the US? And how can we bring those challenges and tackle those challenges in achieving that mission? Now, we'd love to take your questions on this. Please make use of the Q&A function on Zoom, and they will be brought in. Allow me now to introduce the esteemed guest for this fireside conversation. They are John Paul Farmer, Chief Technology Officer of the City of New York. His responsibility is to deliver technology policy, programs, and products that will make New York a more future-ready city. Edward Hartwig is Deputy Administrator of the United States Digital Service. That's the non-partisan technology group within the Executive Office of the President. And from the UK, we're joined by Chris Ferguson, who is a Director in the UK Government Cabinet Office. He's been one of the prime movers in building the UK's Government Digital Services, the GDS, and the National, International and Research Group, which focuses on engaging with the wider public sector and devolved administrations and partner organizations worldwide. And leading this fireside conversation is Singapore's own digital chief. He is Chan Chow Ho, Government Chief Digital Technology Officer of Singapore. Mr. Chan, over to you.
Thank you very much, and good day to everybody. I'm very privileged and honored to have here three friends whom I've known for a couple of years. And we're going to spend the next hour talking about tech for public good. And it's really about, how technology has made a big dramatic change in governments around the world and how it's been tested during this current pandemic that we're facing right now. I'll just like to spend maybe, a little bit of time introducing each other. Maybe I'll start with John Paul. Maybe can you just introduce yourself a little bit more in terms of why are you even in the public sector in the first place?
Well, certainly. Thank you so much for having us here today for this conversation. I think it all goes back to where I grew up. I grew up in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania in the 1980s. And Pittsburgh was, for a long time, the hub of the steel industry. It helped build the industrial age. But in the 1980s, that had ended. And a bunch of those jobs had disappeared, and Pittsburgh was faced with a really difficult choice of how or even whether to reinvent itself. And there were these brownfields, these formerly useful industrial sites that people in public positions of trust had to figure out what would they be next. And I got to see a bunch of these brownfields up close. Just so happens my dad was in the city planning department and was working on these. So I was a kid, and on Saturday mornings he would drag me to these places and tell me what the plans were for how they were going to give new life to this former steel mill. And over time, I've come to see organizations and economic brownfields and social brownfields, even digital brownfields. They're not just these physical pieces of real estate. They're all around us. And I think 2020 has made that really clear. It wasn't a direct path that I took to becoming Chief Technology Officer of New York City. After college, I ended up playing baseball for a couple of years, which was a lot of fun. I got to live all over the country and play a game for a living. But then I worked in the private sector. I was given the opportunity to go to work in the Obama White House, which was not at all part of my plan. I didn't think that I would be doing public service, at least at that point in my life, but I saw the opportunity to make things better for millions of people, and I couldn't pass that up. And I think that's when I got the bug. And people talk about the impact that you can have at scale when working in the public sector. I've worked in the federal government here in the United States. I've worked in the private sector, most recently at Microsoft, and now with the city of New York. And in each place, I found the ability to have that impact at scale. And that's what wakes me up every day and gets me excited to do this work. In the job that I have now as Chief Technology Officer of New York City, there are four pillars to the work. The first being universal broadband, the second being digital services, the third, inclusive innovation, and then finally, tech policy. And those were in place prior to the pandemic. But the pandemic has really made us change the way we approach problems, the way we prioritize. And I think this reinforces one of the points that I share with anyone I talk to, really, which is plan and pencil. It's important to make plans, but it's also important to recognize that sometimes you have to take out the eraser and you have to change those plans because the reality, the world around you changes. And that will present either new opportunities for you or new challenges. And you need to be able, at any given moment, to change what you're doing, to step up and address the needs of the moment. And I hope that's what we're doing here in 2020 and we'll be doing in the years to come. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, thank you, John Paul. Edward, tell us your story.
Thank you all for having me. It's great to see familiar faces and old friends. I will say I also have an unusual route to where I am today. Actually, I started out my professional career. I actually started out my career as a plumber, but I started my professional career after that as a lawyer. I was a public defender, and I did tried criminal cases in court, working for the state of Massachusetts. But I did study international law in school, and so I ended up building a career in the Foreign Service and as a U.S. diplomat for over a decade. My technology focus actually comes from my father. I grew up in the home of an early tech entrepreneur, and so I was always tinkering around with computers when I was growing up. And it was something I did routinely in the Foreign Service to try and build better tools to make the processes that I was working on more efficient. And eventually, I actually started the idea of using technology and entrepreneurship as a tool of diplomacy to bring together the different threads of diplomacy into a cohesive argument. So we could talk about, open fora for conversations. We could talk about open markets. We could talk about entrepreneurship as a way of bringing people together and expressing our cultural values. And so I had a great career. Eventually, I retired and I took over a nonprofit working on public health technology, actually. And then I got a call to join the Obama White House. To be honest, I had felt that my career in public service was over, but I was intrigued by the promise that there was a better way to do things, that there was a method where we could accomplish more quickly, and that method would focus around human beings, would focus around the needs of the citizens that we're trying to serve. Something that I had tried to do in my career in the Foreign Service around immigration. But this was an opportunity to do it sort of at a very high level. And I was intrigued enough that I came back. And to be honest, it's the best decision I have ever made. I'm very lucky to work with an exceptional group of very talented, very diverse, very outspoken people who have nothing but our country's best interests at heart. I think that's the core of any good team, and especially any good technology team. So glad to be here, glad to have the opportunity to learn and share, and looking forward to what comes next.
Thank you, Edward. Over to you, Chris.
Hi, Cheow. Thank you so much to everybody in Singapore for inviting me and letting me join this conversation. Unlike everyone else, I'm actually a career government official. So instead of talking about how I ended up in government, maybe I should talk about why I've stayed. But first, I should just say I'm a career civil servant. I was part of the original team back in 2011 that created the Government Digital Service, part of the original senior management team. I've worked in our digital identity program, government as a platform, where we created various cross-government platforms and things, GovUK, our single domain. And I've loved every minute of it, including the terrifying moments, of which there have been more than enough. But if I talk about why I've stayed in government, why I've stayed in GDS, I'm the only remaining person from that senior team. It's because I absolutely fell in love with the mission. And I think there's something about knowing that the work you're doing is having an impact on a population scale, and is making a difference in people's lives. There's something to that makes it really quite addictive. It creates a gravity that's very hard to break away from. And also, I've always said to myself, or certainly have for the last few years, that I'm in government to do the jobs you can only do if you're in government. If I just wanted to be a program director and get paid a lot of money, I could leave. I could join any number of organizations and do that. So I love being in government and doing the jobs where there is no equivalent in industry. You don't get this kind of responsibility. You don't get this kind of challenge. And it's a great feeling to when you're doing your job well. And I get to work with so many incredibly talented people, and I've learned so much because I'm not from a technical background. But after 9 years, I've absorbed a huge amount of knowledge. and understanding. And so that creates a responsibility as well. So I'm also evidence that you can grow your own digital and technology capability. You don't always have to bring it in from outside. You can develop it. It only takes 9 years. Over to you, Joe.
Thank you, Chris. I think my background is no different. I spent most of my career, in fact, about 23 years of my career in the private sector. I was very much in financial service all my life. And then one day I had an epiphany whereby I think there is more to just making money for a bank. And I think joining the government was a good thing. I learned a lot. I started realizing what purpose is all about in terms of doing technology for the good of a greater good of people in Singapore, as well as collaborating with other countries like my friends here. So with that in mind, maybe let me just take the conversation to a different level. Today everyone's talking about the pandemic. It's a new normal. I think the important thing is that what are some of the factors that's really helped us cope with this sudden onset of COVID-19, and the importance of the digital options available. Maybe let me just pass it over to John Paul, and then I'll comment a little bit later about Singapore. John?
Certainly, it's a good question. It's the thing that is the most important issue right now. It's affecting all of us, is the pandemic and its effects. As I mentioned earlier, you plan in pencil. So if you do things right, then you've got some capacity within government that you can direct toward the needs of the day, toward whatever emergencies arise. And clearly this was a citywide emergency across all 8.5 million people that live in New York City, affected everybody and affected every part of the government too. People had to figure out how to work from home and figure out new ways to deliver services for this new reality. And there were a few different pieces that were essential to allowing that to happen, for allowing the city government, the functions to continue to happen, and allowing the city government to respond effectively to the health crisis. And one of those was data, just having eyes on the virus, understanding where, which communities were most heavily impacted, which hospitals were short on PPE, personal protective equipment, things like masks and gowns. We had those being produced in the city. We were purchasing some were being donated. Obviously, every healthcare facility at the peak of the pandemic needed them. And so managing that process is a data-intensive, real-time exercise. And so having the capacity to get the data, stand up the platforms that would allow decision makers to make sense of the data, that was one thing that was essential. Second is tools, making sure that we actually could use the tools. I mentioned that everyone had to work from home suddenly. And most civil servants had never used Zoom or Microsoft Teams or Google Meet or any of the platforms that are now just how people do their work. And so for both government employees, but also for residents, for small businesses, they had to figure out how they could conduct their business online, and how they could use these digital tools in many cases for the first time ever, and do that in a way that's safe and secure. So that was the second piece of the work. The last two are related. The third one I'll mention is talent, the people who actually have the skills to deliver services in this digital age, but then also the networks that we have to the outside world. And those two things go hand in hand, because the reality is we don't have enough digital native talent inside of government. I think this is true of many governments around the United States and around the world. So we were able to tap into our networks of tech companies, individual technologists who, in a really inspiring show of solidarity, raised their hands and said, I want to be a part of helping. Even if it's not my day job, I'm going to find whatever time I can to help out the response that society's making to this pandemic. And we were able to work with fantastic nonprofits that really got stood up out of nowhere in response to the pandemic. One of them is called the US Digital Response here in the United States. And that group collected technologists who had expressed interest and connected them to a number of cities around the country, including New York. We've been able to create a program called the the NYCX Innovation Fellows in collaboration with USDR, this nonprofit. And we've been able to do things like address hate crimes through data. We've been able to address how we can optimize the use of our real estate assets, our micro assets all around the city, to expand broadband access. We've been able to focus on things like continuous translation, so we can have more of our content translated into the hundreds and hundreds of languages that are spoken here in New York City every single day to ensure that critical information and critical services are reaching every person in our city. So those are a few examples on the data, tools, talent, and networks front of how we've responded to this really unprecedented need, and how we've put in place what I hope are some tools and systems and ways of doing the work of government that will remain and continue to benefit New Yorkers long after this pandemic is over.
Thank you, John Paul. I mean, I always believe that a crisis brings out the best of people, and I certainly see that within GovTech and the Singapore government, whereby, very talented engineers, people I respect a lot, kind of just stepped forward and made it happen. It was quite shocking that we were able to do what we did in the last couple of months during the pandemic. And I think one of the most important things is talent. We are lucky that GovTech had really built this talent base for the last 5.5 to 6 years. And being able to call on bright, intelligent people to come together to solve a problem is a tremendous thing. And, when we first started, we really did not know how we could contribute. But the reality is that we're living in a digital age, and everybody expected digital tools to kind of help in the fight for the COVID-19. And when we started doing apps like, for example, Trace Together, it was shocking that the team could do it in a couple of weeks. No tenders, no big time, what you call system integrators, etc. A small team put together an app in a couple of weeks. And then we went on to say that, well, the app is good, but not everybody has a phone, or not every old person, for example, could use a phone well. Next thing we did was that we did a token. And together with the TT app and TT token, we now have an ecosystem of about more than 3 million people carrying them. Now, I think the way we have done it is unprecedented. It brought out the best in people. People were working literally 16 hours a day, 7 days a week, and nobody cared. People just wanted to solve a problem. And I think that's the beauty of people coming forward. I think one of the other thing which is quite important, and I'm not trying to sell anything here, but it was our ability to step up very quickly with the commercial cloud. It was important because we were able to scale up really, really quickly without all the problems that we normally face with so-called older infrastructure. And I think we were lucky in the sense that we developed the cloud policy as well as our ability to get this together many years ago. So it's not something we did just today, we did many years ago. And also, all kinds of requests are coming in, and it was hitting us from all angles. It was quite funny, right? When we first started the circuit breaker, whereby people were asked to stay at home, we realized that we had to basically go online. The whole public sector had to go online. And, before that, very few people used a video conference like this. And then all of a sudden, about 150,000 civil servants have to go online. And I was scared. I was really scared that the infrastructure will collapse. But, lo and behold, the Monday came and gone. And, we literally were hosting 80,000, 90,000 people online with very little glitch. I won't say without a glitch. And this is, again, the beauty of technology, the ability to scale. I think the last thing I want to mention is the fact that, we reacted to problems that was just out there. For example, many buildings were having to screen temperatures, and they were forming big queues because people took time to take temperature one by one. And a couple of my engineers they said, well, there must be a better way to do this, right? So they went out to check, and they found that thermal cameras are very expensive. They were like $10,000, $15,000 per camera. So these guys did was to put together their own thermal camera using commercial cameras by using a deep learning algorithm as a firmware. And we built it for $500 US. And all of a sudden, it became affordable. And it solved a lot of the issues that were faced by the country in the very beginning. So the long and short is that we were able to respond. It was a big test. And I'm sure many people were asking the question, well, you guys talk great things about digital technology, but the reality is that when the time comes, can you scale up? Can you make it happen? And I think many of us have proven that it can be done. And it's all thanks to the talent that we have, as well as the many volunteers that help us. You know, I was very heartened by the fact that more than 600 people across the world volunteered to help us. Yeah, Singaporeans living in London, in New York, in San Francisco, they all put up their hands and say, what can I do to help? And I think this sense of community is a beautiful thing to see, because you feel encouraged, you feel that there's a lot of good in this world and that things can be solved in a community, and not just by, like what you say, John Paul, not just by yourself. And I think working together was a great thing. Now, but you know something, all these things did not happen by pure serendipity, right? You know, looking back, many of the things that we have done pre-COVID, the things we built for digital government, the things that we talk about, smart city, etc., many of these things have really prepared us for this new normal. You know, if we have not invested in the past and build up the capabilities as well as infrastructure, we would be in a very difficult position. So maybe let me introduce Chris again, and let Chris tell us about the story of GDS and how that has kind of like led to where we are today. Chris?
Thank you, Cheow. Yeah, I think we have in the UK, because we've had a clear digital leader at the centre of government for now nearly 10 years. There's an interesting and fairly objective comparison I can make. So in the early days of GDS, 2012 to 2014, we created, as a stimulus, we created something called the Exemplar Programme. And the idea was we were going to take 25 of our largest government services and we were going to digitize them. We were going to redesign them as digital services, digital first services. And we gave ourselves 400 days to do that. And in the end, I think we ended up with around 22 had got to live status, and then the others were kind of alpha, beta, you know, but that was a catalyst to force us to look at what standards and what standardization was going to be needed and how to integrate. You know, so there you go. That was then. When COVID hit us, we stood up 125 new digital services in about 100 days. So that's 6 years later. But you know, in terms of the performance improvement, that's quite dramatic. And so I was thinking to myself, well, what were the ingredients that allowed us to do that? What was new in 2020 that wasn't there in 2012, 13, 14, that gave us such greater pace? So I think, first of all, we spent a lot of time in GDS developing exhaustive standards for our digital services, for our technology, you know, for how technology is adopted, and robust assessment mechanisms too. That's kind of boring sounding, but it's true. We defined our profession. So the digital data and technology kind of profession inside the UK government. We did this after 2014, but we defined clear job families and career progression pathways and things like that to stop it being the Wild West, basically, of recruitment, where people doing very similar jobs could be paid wildly different amounts of money. And it allowed people to see a career in the civil service, and also allowed us to understand which elements maybe of digital data and technology roles didn't necessarily have to be a lifelong career in government. It could be something that you do for a few years as a tour of duty and then move on. We also invested in our government as a platform program, where we put in place platforms around notifications, around payments, around identity, where there would be a single approach across the government. And what that meant was that new services could assemble these components, which basically come pre-approved against our standards and against the various scrutiny and governance, so that they're really focusing on the key things that matter to deliver a policy or an outcome, and they've already can assemble maybe 40, 50% or more of what their service requires. But probably, and maybe slightly, you know, improbably, one of the most important elements was that because of Brexit, which is the process of the UK leaving the European Union, we had to create some quite sophisticated channels into industry and into the marketplace in order to support that agenda. So when COVID hit, we actually had a far more sophisticated way of approaching industry to ask for quite specific needs around digital services, around technology. And it turned out we had we had better configured the marketplace of suppliers in the UK to react quickly and react flexibly to what we were needing. And that really supported us. And as Cheow has said, and John Paul, it was a massive team effort. The voluntary sector, the government sector, industry, private citizens, it was all about being available and listening and spotting what was successful and incorporating it. So going back to if GDS had never existed, do I think really that all of those things would have happened anyway? I'm not so sure they would have. And if they had, they may have happened in quite a fragmented way. So maybe some large departments would have their own standards or their own channels into industry. But because we were able to speak as the UK government with a single voice, either to industry, to the voluntary sector, or to ourselves, quite honestly, and say, this is the focus, this is a priority, this is the guidance, this is the standard, it allowed us to move quickly without breaking everything, and the challenge then was in how do we accelerate, how do we move faster, how do we do these things without compromising all of the values that we've developed and held strongly to over the last few years, and show that you can do it to high standards, even in a crisis, even in an emergency, and you don't have to sacrifice quality, you don't have to sacrifice your principles to get things done. And that was a great lesson. And my final point is, I've said throughout, if I could put any of this in a bottle, to take forward to drink next year, when hopefully the crisis is behind us, it's the collaboration that happened organically between departments. Everyone just said, right, what matters, what is important, let's work together and get this done. And all of the jurisdiction and turf and fiefdoms, none of that mattered. Everyone just wanted to deliver the best possible outcome as fast as possible for our end users and meet their needs. And for me, that's something I hope we can preserve in the culture of the UK government moving forwards.
Thank you, Chris. Edward, USGS has done a fantastic job in terms of its influence on transforming the US government digitally, and you brought in really some very good people. So what was the journey like to kind of like get us to where we are today?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting to look back. I think unlike GDS, the US has a distributed approach, sort of a ground up approach to solving these problems, and for a very good reason. For example, the Department of Veterans Affairs in the United States is actually roughly equivalent to the civil service of the UK, serves a equal number of people, and also meets their needs across a large range of services, from education services to actually running the largest health provider in the United States. And so, when one agency of your government is 400,000 employees serving 30 million active users, it has allowed us to sort of approach problems that are tailored specifically to the needs of the agency. But what it has also done is it has meant that some agencies have succeeded more than others. And so what we can really take, I think, from the American federal experience is looking at the differences between who succeeded and who wasn't succeeding during this pandemic. And what I would say is that the pandemic has served to show us the difference between success and failure, that delta has grown fairly dramatically. And so we can really see, I think, what worked and what didn't. So by way of example, we have a list of 20 high impact service providers, is what they're called, 20 of the most important services that the United States government gives to its citizens. And on the dawn of the pandemic, only one service was actually meeting the needs of its citizens digitally, or meeting the needs of its citizens at all once people were trapped in their homes. And that was in fact the Department of Veterans Affairs. And so I think the lesson we learned there is exactly the point of your question, which is we weren't trying to like digitize the Veterans Affairs Department today. We had spent 5 long years investing in people, investing in tools, investing in the infrastructure to run the VA. We had spent 5 years interviewing veterans, talking to them about their needs, how they understand, how they want to interact with the government. And in doing so, in April of this year, the VA was already meeting 80% of all of veterans' needs online in under 10 minutes. And so what that means to me, if you contrast that to another agency, for example, that had to rush to get healthcare forms up online for people that were over the age of 65 who had lost their jobs, like that's a critical area that we need to address in a pandemic. And they did. They did a great job. Like they got a form up online. They were able to recover. They were able to work with people. But the difference there is that, well, they were trying to meet the basic needs of the agency, like the basic mandate for what we owed our citizens as our government. The VA, on the other hand, was dealing with very high concept issues. They were triaging the different types of telehealth, video telehealth versus audio telehealth. Right? So it turns out that COVID patients don't need to be on video to have a screening process with their doctor. And so we can put those people on audio, which allows us to use more high bandwidth services like video for critical cases of substance abuse or mental health, where visual cues are important to a doctor. It allows us to focus on things like the VA had a great successful trial in increasing the number of volunteers who would participate in a vaccine trial. They increased the number of volunteers by 15 times just by using simple digital tools. And so while many agencies were barely meeting their mandate, the agencies that had spent 4 or 5 years investing in those tools, investing in those services, investing in their people, really rose to the occasion. And I think that is, to me, the important part, and that's the part I want to hold on to going forward, is that we can meet these challenges, but we will not only reduce the likelihood that there will be a disaster, that we will exacerbate a disaster, but we will also, in the event that a disaster does come, alleviate the amount of harm that comes from that disaster if we take the time to invest early. We know this works. We know it's more efficient. We know it's more effective. We know it's more humane and accessible. And so I think as we look back on what we've done, we can celebrate our successes. But the United States is a large country with a large bureaucracy, and it has a long way to go to meeting every citizen's need in the way that they expected in the 21st century. So I think, luckily, what we've learned from this is that technology actually isn't the hard part. Right? Getting these technologies built is not hard. What's hard is aligning people's incentives towards a common goal. And one of the things about a pandemic, one of the things about a crisis, is that people do put their differences aside and they focus on the end goal of getting people the services they need. And if we can keep that alignment and keep that focus on citizen services alive, then we can bring the technology. Like, the technology is there, the people are there, the mission is there. People want to come and do these things. As we've seen, like John Paul said, from the US Digital Response and others, people are ready to step up and build a better digital government. I think we need to spend our time now making sure those people have access, making sure there are ways that they can help us, and making sure that we respect the tools that they build and that we respect the people that we are trying to serve, and work from them backward. And I think that that's the lesson we're learning. And I wish it didn't take a pandemic to get there, but I do think that there are millions of civil servants in America that are doing an excellent job and are fighting for people. And technology, I think, is the way that we honor that service and we enhance it and we make it more effective.
Oh, thanks, Edward. I mean, that's fantastic, because the reality is that, when something like this happens, we put everything aside and we just focus on what's good for the country. And I think that's what it's all about. Now, with this, it becomes quite obvious that post-pandemic, in a sense, or a new normal that people call it, technology will become increasingly critical for city survival. And I think COVID in some ways demonstrated that. But where do we think we go from here? I mean, I don't think there's any turning back. John Paul, your views?
Well, a lot of people have predicted the demise of the city, and some have predicted the demise of New York City in particular. But I have to say, I am very bullish on the future of New York City and bullish on the future of cities. And there's a really simple reason for this. We've been through crises before. We've been through pandemics before, and they're trying times, and they change us, and we adapt. But ultimately, there are reasons that people live in cities and gather together. People like to be together. It's human nature. They like the arts and the culture and the parks and the opportunity for these happy collisions that happen when you run into someone literally on the street. That leads to progress over time. The more of those happen, that leads to good things. It leads to collaboration. And as Eddie pointed out, and Chris before him, collaboration is our superpower. This is what human beings do so well. This is what has allowed us to progress so much. And I think cities will continue to play a critical role for that simple reason. Now, we should recognize that there will be change, and the now ubiquity of remote work and the fact that people now understand how to use these tools, have adapted to them, we'll probably see a changing nature of what work looks like. That will affect commercial real estate, certainly, likely residential real estate, might make some cities more livable and more affordable. Not an entirely bad thing, but will cause change. I think that for us to ensure that New York City continues to thrive, we're going to need to make sure that we are using technology to address the needs of the people in our city. So there's a reason for them to be here. So we often talk about a smart city, but of course, a smart city has to be equitable. It has to serve everybody. So are we actually helping the unbanked? Are we helping people who have mobility challenges? Are we helping people get access to telehealth and actually have better access to healthcare because they've got universal broadband? And I know this is something that Singapore is very much a leader on. Here in the United States and in New York, we recognize that broadband is as essential in 2020 and beyond as electricity was 100 years ago. It's a foundational technology that allows so much progress to happen. But we've had to put in place an internet master plan just this year to ensure that we close that digital divide, which has persisted. And this internet master plan that we've created, it's a 4G and 5G connectivity plan. So it's a technology plan, but it's also a racial equity plan to make sure that everybody, no matter who they are, what their background is, has equal access and can adopt these foundational technologies that can be so transformational. And of course, it's an economic development plan, which is essential as we think about the recovery and how we build back better. So these are the things that we're thinking about. These are the tools that we know we're going to need to have in place to ensure that New York City comes back and thrives.
Thank you, John. Chris, now what do you think from London's point of view? How is it going to change London the way we see it?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I can't improve on John Paul's assessment of cities and the role of cities going forwards. I think he's hit the nail on the head. What I think I'll look at is the what I've seen and the reaction from society in the cities, but also frankly from the wider UK, and how we might need to respond. So I think we've seen a massive acceleration of adoption. I'm sure people listening have family members, have bosses, or have staff who were not particularly great at video conferencing or adopting of that kind of technology, but who now are enthusiastic adopters and users of those things, even a little too much in some cases, I'm sure. So there's been an acceleration of adoption of technology. So essentially the user base has grown. The ends of the spectrum have pushed out. I think that has increased expectations across the board in industry, but in government in particular, that the end user expectations have grown. Like, why can't I have my health services delivered online then? Why can't I complete this entire service, even if it does mean a human interaction? Why can't we do that? We've done it during COVID. So I think it's created a challenge around responsiveness for government. How responsive are our services to the new growing expectations of our end users? And I think I'd add to that, like, what do we need then if we're going to be more responsive, whether it's at a London level, a UK level? What are we going to need to be more responsive? We're going to need to be able to personalize digital service provision, which brings us back to things like digital identity. How robust is our how ubiquitous is digital identity? It makes us consider matters of accessibility, and as John Paul just said, equality. I do not want a 2 or a 3-tier digital society to emerge based on people's ability to access public services, or on what kind of broadband connection they do or don't have, on what kind of mobile, how good are they at using a smartphone, which is an incredibly sophisticated piece of technology. So for any reason, I don't want to be leaving people behind and creating a multi-tiered public sector. And then finally, flexibility, I think, is really important. Our ability to deliver services in a 24/7, 365 way, not just to meet the needs of our end users, but to realize how they live their lives, and to realize that this is something we also need to incorporate. As I'm sure many of us have had to book blocks of time out in the middle of the day to do childcare or homeschooling, things like that. If we are going to move into a more remote working world, then that's going to persist. we're going to need to realize, that just like banks did, that you can't expect everybody to show up between 9:30 and 5 p.m. You're going to have to make your service available, more available than that. So I think that, cities, is almost a metonym for society. It's a concentration of those societal needs. And if we need to be more responsive and we need to be, acknowledge those raised expectations, then personalization, accessibility, equality, and flexibility are things we're going to have to bake into our mindset and our strategy going forwards.
Thank you, Chris. So from the conversation, it's quite obvious that talent is so important, because without talent, none of these things can happen. So how do we attract literally a creative class of people to work in government? And this is really something very important for survival of government going forward. Maybe let me get Edward to talk about it, because he has been quite passionate about bringing really good people into USDS. Edward?
Yeah, thanks. This is truly one of my passions, so I'll try to remain relatively brief. Well, to be honest, this is, I think, where it all begins. Like, you need talented people. You need people that are here specifically not just for technology, but to bring technology to the table with other decision makers. Like, this is, like I said before, this is not necessarily about technology in a vacuum. This is about aligning policy. It's about aligning like budgets and procurement, like how we buy things. It's also about aligning, the values of individual agencies and services. And so the products that we build should embody the people and the meaning that we're trying to deliver. And so to do that, you really need a really great team. And I think it's always, the trope is always that government has a hard time competing with the private sector in this regard because of pay. And I just want to put that aside for a second, because the kind of people that you want serving in government, people like John Paul, people like Chris, are people that are not here for the money. They want money. Their needs need to be met. They need to be paid a equivalent wage or close to equivalent wage, but it's the mission that brings them. And I would argue that if you have somebody who's not there for the mission, then that's not the right person to build your digital technology. Because the mission it's fascinating. Chris said it in the beginning, like, governments have a monopoly over some of the things we care most deeply about. Helping, processes like immigration, helping soldiers and veterans and retired soldiers, taking care of the people that are at the fringes of society, the unbanked, people that, they're people to whom there is no market incentive to help. And that is a core value of government. And so I think when you put that before people and you ask them whether they want to keep working on a more accurate pizza tracking app for their delivery service, or whether they want to help 24 million people get access to healthcare for the first time potentially in their lives, people will come. I think there are things that we can do, though. Like, one, I think we do actually just need to get out on the market and compete. We need to stop pretending like people will come to government just because government is there. We need to actively recruit. We need to go where technologists are. And that's not in the United States, not just Silicon Valley, not just New York. Sorry, John. It's not just Boston, but it's a representative group of people, a diverse group of people from across the country. So we go to, Pittsburgh, we go to Nashville, we go to Texas, because there are great technologists in all walks of life, in all places in the country. There are great technologists that have expertise in healthcare, that have expertise in law, that have expertise in things like immigration. And so, one, I think we need to get out there, but we also need to make some changes. Government traditionally, at least the United States government, has traditionally worked on a hierarchical model, which is the longer you're in the government, the more you rise up in the ranks. Well, the problem is, how do you hire someone who's an expert in an emerging technology when they need to have 10 years of experience in that emerging technology for you to pay them equivalently, right? Like, I can't find somebody who has 10 years of experience in a 6-year-old field. And so we need to start, I think, by doing, what 18F, if you're familiar with them, at the General Services Administration in the United States, what USDS have done, which is creating some special hiring authorities to bring that talent in. But once that talent is there, we need to start establishing routes to make those positions not special hiring authorities, not temporary hiring authorities, but permanent. We need to build a stronger, more effective, more digitally literate civil service. And hat tip to the UK, because they have done an excellent job of shifting to addressing what many people consider the boring stuff, right? But what is really the fundament of our government, which is things like Like, is there a technology requirement for your cabinet level minister, right? They should be aware, right? Do senior civil servants have an awareness of how technology is important? Because really, even before COVID, technology was solving our last mile problem, was solving some of the problems that we're talking about here about accessibility. And so, I think what we need to do is, I think we need to be more proactive in our recruiting and our mission. We need to talk about the good that government does, and that attracts talent. We also need to clean up our back end, in a sense, which is to say we need to make it faster to onboard into government. We make it easier to onboard into government. We need to be more remote accessible. We need to meet technologists where they are in their field. But when we bring them in, we also need to empower them, and we need to give them access, and we need to bring them to the table. We need to give them a voice. And I think if we do that, if we can create a workforce that is digitally literate, that is technically savvy, and that has a voice in discussions, not the only voice, but one voice to try and build a better delivery of services, so that we're talking about how we're going to deliver the service when we write the policy, not writing the policy and then sort of like glomming the technology on at the end. I think that there's a lot that we can do to improve the way that all governments function. And in doing so, I actually think that we can start making government something that people aspire to. And so it's a bit of a virtuous circle where you have to put in the investment at first, but once you get it going, I think it becomes a place where people want to serve. And I think USDS has proven the point in the small scale. And I think the next challenge is, how do we take what we've learned in the few experiments that we've had in the United States, like USDS, and how do we apply that to the greater civil service? And how do we attract tens of thousands of technologists to come and serve the government and serve the public and deliver better services that meet the expectations of a modern society? So it is possible. I think we can do it. I think it has been done in small ways, but now I think the real trick is to scale up. And I think environments like this, forums like this, where we can talk and learn from one another, are really how we work together to solve some of these trickier, more boring, but bureaucratic, but truly, truly important problems, like attracting and retaining the best talent in the world.
Thank you, Edward. Yeah, I'll just sum up the discussion. I mean, the thing is that talent's important. In Singapore, we try to create very much a culture within the government. There is no reason why the government cannot create a culture that supports innovation, that allows people who are technologists to thrive. But what's more important is the fact that people need to have a sense of purpose. We hire people in the government because of a sense of purpose. It's not just about money. Of course, hygiene factors are important, as Edward mentioned, but getting people into the government is because you have an opportunity to solve real problems that are pretty tough if you look at it in a way. But once you're able to do that, it benefits literally millions of people. And I think one other thing which is quite important is, technology isn't the only thing, as Edward mentioned. The ability to work together with the policy people, with people in operations, those are very important things. It cannot be just tech-led or none at all. It has to be part of a group of people coming to the table and solving a real difficult problem and getting the satisfaction of working together to change something that we have always complained about. And I think that's really quite important for many of us when we join the government. We're here to solve a problem. We used to complain about it, but I think at the end of the day, put your work into it, solve the problem, and stop complaining about it. That's how I think many of us felt after a while. So, I'd like to thank really, our guests here, three friends, and we have been working together for quite a while. And maybe we'll take some questions now. And I think there are a lot of questions out there. Let me just pull up some questions. The first question was that, what's the most challenging experience you and your team have encountered in helping teams in the public sector embrace new tools and the ongoing digital transformation? Public sectors around the world have been notoriously known for being bureaucratic and resistant to change. For those who are older and could have stopped learning a long time ago. Well, difficult question. Well, who wants to take that? John Paul, what do you think? Just take a crack at it.
Happy to chime in. It's a great question. And I think the biggest challenge that we faced has been getting our colleagues to focus on the future. And if you think about it, it's perfectly understandable, especially at the city level, people are responsible for delivering a service day in and day out. People are counting on them to make sure that the snow is removed, the trash is picked up, those kinds of things. And so when you start thinking about something that might not actually affect things for 6 or 12 months, a lot of folks are just too busy to take the time and address those. And then when you put in place a pandemic and an economic crisis, that actually makes that challenge even tougher, because people really have life and death decisions that they're making today. And to get them to think about the future, even if that future is 2 months, 3 months in the future, that's a challenge. There are only so many hours in a day, and people have so much on their plates that it can be hard for them to just take a step back and think about either a new challenge that is likely to arise a couple of months from now, or improvements that can be made to the systems that are in place. And that's something where I feel like our office, the mayor's office of the CTO, with our work on inclusive innovation, on digital services, et cetera, it's our responsibility to do that work, because I recognize that so many of our colleagues simply don't have the bandwidth, the time, or even the mandate to do it. I think that's why it's so important that each government put in place the capacity to have some people trying to look ahead, to look around the corners and think about what's coming next, and think about the improvements that can be put in place.
Thank you. Digital transformation is not an easy thing that even the Singapore government has gone through. We think that one big thing about digital transformation is education. Leaders all the way down to people on the ground implementing need to understand what technology can and cannot do. And we actually spend a lot of time educating ourselves as well as the people around us, and including senior leaders. Once we know the expectations, then I think people become more realistic about what digital transformation is all about, and will execute according to something that makes sense. And like we mentioned just now, it's not just about the technologies that will make this happen. It has to cover the entire public sector. Bureaucracy is there because a lot of times of unknowns and conservatism, but when people are educated enough to understand how to approach a problem, a lot of times they come together and they work together to make it happen. And like, again, a sense of urgency created by pandemic really helps a lot, because it pushes through a lot of the so-called bureaucracy before, and people start realizing that focusing on the mission and the problem is more important than just trying to dot the I's and cross the T's, basically. And it has been proven to happen. I think Singapore is a great example of that. And I'm quite optimistic that this will continue as we move forward. Let me look for another question. Okay, what is the most challenging experience you and your team have encountered in helping teams in public sector embrace new tools and the ongoing digital transformation? Maybe I'll just start off a little bit, and I'll toss it to Edward. I think one of the things about the paradigm of public sector technology for a long time is that we will build everything from scratch. It's very much a bespoke culture. If I need a system to do business grants, for example, I will get a vendor, I'll build everything from scratch. The concept of reusability and adopting of tools is like non-present. So, Chris mentioned a little bit just now about government as a platform. I think many of us are adopting the concept. Very much like many of the tech firms today, the way government approach technology is no more just about getting a vendor to build everything from scratch. It's about using common tools out there in the market, using the cloud infrastructure, using software as a service. And all these things have been proven to be very effective in not just reducing costs, but improving the quality of software that we build. So one example is that a lot of people challenged me a long time ago that there's no way I can do a software as a service for the government. But lo and behold, today, quite a few agencies in the government in Singapore today are using Workday for human resources and finance. Now, just 2 years ago, that was like almost blasphemous and sacrilegious. But today, that's happening. So people can do that. The government is changing dramatically. And I think the important thing is to demonstrate the benefit that we do. Edward, more comments?
Yeah, I think it's a fascinating question. And I think it also goes to the last question about why government is so slow to adopt these technologies. One, it's great. There are oftentimes places where we can make huge leaps because there are solutions like Workday out there. But again, a lot of what the government does is fairly proprietary. And so there isn't always an off-the-shelf solution. A lot of times, at least in the United States, we're dealing with 40-year-old systems. And it's not just the question of replacing these systems, because it's not like we can take it down for a day. Something like Medicare in the United States, which is the largest insurance company in the world, pays $2 billion a day into the market. If we took Medicare down for a week to replace it, then we would remove $10 billion from the market in 5 days. And so I think we need to be careful when we're talking about these things. We also can't break them, right? Like if we break them, the consequences are even more serious. And so when we think about how we're going to move these forward, we need to remember that many of these systems are built using older methodologies like waterfall or before, using very static, very stable, but not necessarily efficient code, things like COBOL and MUMPs that were written before my time on this planet. And so when we do that, we need to not only move to new systems, but we need to move the infrastructure underneath it. We need to move the mindset of the people that are building it and maintaining it. And we need to shift until we can move the government from or at least the US government from the 1970s to the early 2000s. That's where we are now. Once we get them in a place where they're using modern cloud tools, they're using infrastructure and software as a service, they can accelerate rapidly. But the challenge we're actually trying to solve is actually one of the back on the underlying infrastructure. And so like we need to move those people forward to where they can actually start to iterate, where they can use design as a tool more effectively. And once we get there, I think you will see governments moving more dramatically. And I think the other last point I want to make is that I think that I represent the one person on the panel here that isn't city focused. And there are other challenges out there. It is easy to say like, hey, why don't we make accessing the government as easy as accessing my bank account? But at least for me in the federal level, we're not talking necessarily all about people that have access to broadband in cities or even have access to decent cell phone reception. In the United States, we have urban counties, which include cities. We have rural counties, which are outside cities, but some of our states have what are called frontier counties, where counties where there are hundreds of miles between people. And so there's no incentive to build broadband services. There's no incentive to put in place some of the core things that we take for granted in cities. And so for us, it's about not only building the high-tech solutions from the top down and putting in place the broadband and putting in place identity services and personalized, tailored equipment. It's also about making sure that we have services that are so simple and so low bandwidth that they're accessible on a library computer in a rural county or a frontier county where you only have dial-up, because a lot of America still uses dial-up to get their internet, which is when you call over the phone and actually get access to your services. And so it's a both approach. It's a top-down, bottom-up approach, because the core of government is to serve everyone and not someone. It's one of the biggest challenges that we have. And so I think in general, the government does, at least in the United States, does a decent job of meeting people's needs. Could they do better? Absolutely. Could the technology be better? Absolutely. But I do think that we need to get used to the fact that we are not building services for the most technically adept people. We are building services for the least technically adept people. And we are doing it using the best tools we have on hand while we're sort of building the boat while we're sailing it. And so as we take down that approach, if you approach it from that lens, it gives you a different perspective on what success looks like. And so it's great to celebrate the big wins, but it's actually almost more important to celebrate the little wins.
Thank you, Edward. Yeah, in the interest of time, I'm sorry I have to wrap this session up. I think it's very obvious that the way technology has been happening in government has changed quite a fair bit, and that many of the senior people in government has kind of embraced technology in a big way, and it kind of opens up opportunities for many of us to kind of contribute to make things better. So with that, I'd like to thank my guests again. Thank you for joining us, and have a great evening. Thank you.
That was an interesting panel. Loved hearing the different perspectives from the different parts of the world on the pertinent topic of tech for public good. Timo, your work is focused on tech for good as well, isn't it?
It is, Neha, yes.
So tell us more about your work and what did you think about this panel discussion just now? It would be wonderful to hear your insights on this.
Okay, well, let me start with the panel. I mean, that one of those final comments there really kind of woke me up. Was a lot of America still uses dial-up, and for people who live in Singapore, and we have fiber to the home virtually across the nation, that was really quite an eye-opener. But more seriously, very valuable to get the perspectives of people who've been so instrumental in addressing the challenges of deploying tech in the service of goods provision for citizens. And the kind of high level thinking that goes into dealing with serious social challenges like COVID that those gentlemen have been dealing with. But what's really interesting to me is that this same kind of social awakening or awakening to social needs, if you like, has been occurring even beyond COVID. And there are now so many other new initiatives springing up that consider the common good and public impact and environmental impact. And they see tech as a social tool, not just for commercial benefit. And as you say, this is basically what I'm doing to get to the second part of your question. I recently launched Tech for Impact.Asia. I partnered up with the Asian Development Bank to try and drive the awareness and the adoption of sustainable technologies in Asia's developing countries and try to help them leapfrog the legacy tech and adopt more sustainable solutions by giving them some knowledge and information about real products that work here in Asia, and which can really have a positive impact, not just on the environment, but also on the people and the communities in the region. And as I say, I think I'm just part of what is a growing groundswell of general public interest in these kind of things.
Thank you for sharing your thoughts on this subject, and thank you for your meaningful work. Well, and also thank you to our wonderful audience that has been super active with many, many questions. We are, as such, at the end of day one of the Singapore Tech Forum, but we're just at the start of an exciting agenda. We have 3 more days of this fun. Well, we will dig deeper tomorrow on the same topic of tech for good. And well, do check out the buzz that's happening on the virtual lounge on Slack. And don't forget to say hello. With that, we see you tomorrow, same time, 10 p.m. Singapore time.